Hi, welcome to Espresso Equipment. In this short video, I'll introduce you to the key pieces of equipment that you'll need to be familiar with in order to make espresso drinks safely and effectively. There's two pieces of equipment that we'll need to be familiar with. One is, of course, the espresso machine, and the other is a grinder. The espresso machine that we're going to be working with is a Linea AV made by Marzocco. Your machine may be different from this one, but the basic parts and the function is going to be very similar to this one, so it should transfer pretty directly. The grinder that we'll be working with today is a Mythos One made by Nuova Simonelli. It's a very common espresso grinder. There are several other grinders on the market though, so I'll show you a couple others to make sure you're familiar with how your grinder works as well. Let's start by taking a look at the espresso machine. Looking at this machine, you can see that there are 2 points or 2 positions on this machine where you can produce espresso. We call these groups or group heads. Your machine is likely to have anywhere between 1 and 4 of these, but they all work in exactly the same way, so having more just means you can produce more espresso at once. Also, at first glance at the machine, you'll notice that there are steam wands on either side of the machine. Most machines tend to have 2 steam wands on either side, and they work in exactly the same way. Some machines just have 1 steam wand. On machines that have 2, you can use whichever side you're more comfortable with. They work exactly the same. Let's start by taking a closer look at how the group head works. So the group head holds this piece that we'll get to in just a moment called the portafilter. If I remove it and then activate the group heads using these buttons, you can see that it distributes water and then stops. Now, there are a couple of pieces inside of the group head that are important to know a little bit about. One is called the gasket. It's a little rubber ring that looks like this. It just fits up inside of the group head, and it allows the group head and the portafilter to form a tight seal so that when pressurized water is forced through a bed of grounds, you don't have any water leaking out. And then the other component that you need to be familiar with inside of the group head is called a dispersion screen. The dispersion screen, which looks like this, is held in place with a special screw, and the dispersion screen performs 2 important functions for us. One is it helps disperse the water more evenly over the bed of grounds. So if I activate a group head without a dispersion screen and with a dispersion screen, the difference is pretty obvious. Just a quick word of warning, in case you're using a Nuova Simonelli machine like an Appia or an Aurelia, you don't want to run the group heads on those machines without the dispersion screen installed, because the path of the water coming out of the group head is outward rather than downward. So running the group head without the dispersion screen will shoot hot water out at you, so just be careful of that. The other important function that the dispersion screen serves for us is it actually prevents loose grounds from going up inside of the group head mechanism. Inside of this mechanism, there's a 3-way valve that controls the flow of hot water. And when we turn the group head off, there's a little bit of suction that happens because the pressure has stopped when we turn the group head off. So that pressure can actually force loose grounds back up into the valve mechanism. This helps prevent those loose grounds from going into the valve and gumming up the works and causing problems. So it's really important that the dispersion screen is in place anytime the espresso machine is used, not only because it's really important for making good espresso, but also it protects the internal parts of the espresso machine. Just be careful when reinstalling the dispersion screen. You don't want to cross-thread this screw or over-tighten it, so just thread it in with your fingers. It should go in nice and smoothly, and you don't really need to tighten it very much. So just your fingertips should be sufficient. Next, let's look at the portafilter, which is short for portable filter. It's the part of the espresso machine that will hold our ground coffee during the extraction process. There's a couple different styles of portafilter. You may have one that has spouts or one that doesn't. They work in exactly the same way, and in fact, they're pretty much interchangeable, so it doesn't really matter. Spouted portafilters can be nice to have because the spouts let you split your espresso into 2 separate shot glasses if you want. These bottomless portafilters can also be kind of nice because it lets you see how your extraction process is going while it's happening, but both can be used to prepare espresso exactly the same way. There's a few components to the portafilter to be familiar with. The bulk of this is basically the handle, which is a rubber handle and a metal end that's going to be pretty hot because this stays in the machine. This end holds the portafilter basket, which on the bottomless portafilters you can just pop out like that. If you're working with a spouted portafilter, you can pop the basket out just by carefully using a flathead screwdriver, prying it out like so. The basket is, of course, the part that's going to hold our ground coffee. It has some really fine holes in the bottom. Now, the basket is a pretty important part of the espresso making process. The dimensions of this basket effectively determine how much coffee we're going to use anytime we make espresso. And the cleanliness and condition of the basket and the dispersion screen inside of the group head are really important in preparing good, high-quality coffee consistently. So we really are going to pay attention to the cleanliness of the basket and the dispersion screen. I'll go over cleaning procedures for those in another video. And then the basket just can be popped back in place just with a little force. The portafilter is held in the group head by these two tabs or wings on either side here. These fit into two slots that if you angle the portafilter to the left, those tabs will fit right in. And then you turn the handle to the right, and you don't need a whole lot of force. By this point, you should be feeling some resistance, and you don't really need to go much beyond that to form a tight seal with the rubber gasket. And of course, to remove the portafilter, you just reverse that, move the handle to the left. It shouldn't require a whole lot of force, and then the portafilter just comes out of the group head. Next, let's talk about the group head activation buttons or switches. This is the part of the machine that controls the flow of water through the group head. And this is a component that will vary from one machine to the next quite a bit. On some machines, you may just have a single button or switch above the group head. On this machine, for instance, I do have a switch here that will turn the group head on and then off. And if I were to operate the machine using that switch, I would have to do it completely manually, meaning I would have to turn the group head on and then off when I want to stop the flow of water. If you're working with a manual machine that just has a button or switch that you have to start and stop the flow of water, that button or switch may be connected to a timer in the front panel that starts and stops as well, or you may need to have a separate timer that you'll start and stop when you start and stop the flow of water. So besides having switches, this machine also has what's called auto-volumetric functions, which is a really cool feature that introduces some automation into the process. What that means is inside of the machine, there's a meter that measures how much water is flowing through by volume, and we can program different buttons on the group head activation pad here that will essentially determine how much water flows through each time we activate the group head. So I can program a button to shut off the flow of water after a certain volume of water has passed through. So this means that I don't have to stand there and turn the machine off when I want to stop the shot that I'm extracting. It will actually stop by itself once a certain volume of water has gone through the group head. You can also see that this button pad includes a timer. When I start the group head by pushing one of these buttons, it starts counting the time, and it stops automatically when it puts out a set volume of water. It's important to remember that this auto-volumetric function is measuring the volume of water, not the amount of time that it takes for that water to come out. This is going to be really important when we get to dialing in our espresso, because time is going to be a variable, but if we're using auto-volumetrics, that parameter is going to be set for us. It's going to be constant. This particular style of button pad has 3 buttons. The first 2 are ones that we can program for set volumes, and then this swirly symbol here just means continuous pour, so it will just run continuously until I tell it to stop. So we can operate this machine manually effectively using this continuous pour button as well. Next, let's take a look at the steam wands. This is what we're going to use to steam milk when we get to making espresso drinks. There's a couple pieces of this that you need to be familiar with. First, the steam wand itself is made of metal. It gets very hot when steam passes through it, so it's really important to only touch it using this rubber gripper, and that allows you to move the steam wand around without burning your fingers. The other part of this to be familiar with is the mechanism that opens and closes the valve to control the flow of steam. So on this machine we have a knob that I can turn to open and then close the valve. Some machines have a lever instead, so you can pull down and then push back up on the lever to control the valve. The basic function is essentially the same. When I go to open and close the valve for the steam wand, it's really important to have a towel handy to cover the end of the steam wand, because there's going to be some liquid water that has condensed inside of the tube of the steam wand, and then of course steam after that, and we don't want to spray ourselves with water and steam, so it's important to have a clean towel handy to purge the steam wand. This is something that you're gonna be doing on a regular basis to clear out that liquid water and anything that has collected inside of the steam wand. So you're gonna purge the valve both before and after steaming milk on a regular basis. So getting in the habit of this technique is really important. Just covering the steam wand with a clean towel, not with too tight of a grip, and then opening the valve, closing it again, allows me to purge the steam wand of liquid water and any milk that has gotten inside of the steam wand as well. Next, most espresso machines will have some kind of hot water spout built into them that allows you to rinse shot glasses or tools on your bar. So for instance, there's a hot water spout here that will put out hot water when I flip this switch. Like I said, this can be useful for cleaning shot glasses, for instance. But I wouldn't recommend using this water for preparing drinks like Americanos or teas. The reason is that this water actually comes from the steam boiler. That's going to have slightly higher mineral content. It's not dangerous or anything, but it could have a palatable impact on the drink. So use this for cleaning, not for beverages. Next, underneath the group heads, we have a removable tray called the drip tray. And this collects all the water and anything else that falls down through these grates. We can just angle this up and pop it out of the machine. There's a hole off to the side here. I would recommend covering that with a towel so that when we go to clean this, we don't have hot water and espresso grounds dripping out on our feet. This drip tray hole sits right over a drain in the machine that collects any water and anything else that goes down that drip tray. It's really important to try to limit how much you have loose grounds going down this drain, and definitely not milk either. Both of those things can really clog up the plumbing and cause you some problems. Finally, there are a couple other pieces that are handy to know a little bit about. One is the power switch. So all espresso machines are going to have a switch, something like this off to the side that turns the machine on and off. We're just going to leave the machine on all the time though, because it actually takes a lot more energy to heat back up once it's cooled down than it does to stay at temperature once it's already heated up. So just leave the machine on all the time. Next, depending upon the machine that you're working with, you may have gauges or a gauge built into the front panel here, which tells us a couple useful things about the machine. The bottom half of this gauge on this particular machine tells me the pressure of the water going through the group heads whenever I'm pulling a shot. And when I'm actually pulling a shot of espresso, this should read about 9 bars. Bars is the unit for this gauge. The top half of this gauge tells me the pressure inside of the steam boiler, and that should be somewhere between 1 and 1.5 bars on a regular basis. All right, so that covers our espresso machine. Next, we'll take a look at grinders. I have here a Nuova Simonelli Mythos One, a Mahlkönig K30, and a Mazzer Luigi. You may not have any of these 3 grinders, but the grinder that you do have will be sufficiently similar that what I can show you here should transfer pretty directly to what you're working with. So what I want to show you are the common key features that you'll find on your espresso grinder and give you a brief overview on how they work. Let's start with the Mythos One. So first off, on the Mythos One grinder, there's a power switch off to the side here. Depending upon the version of this grinder that you're using, this front silver piece here may have a heating element built into it. The Klima Pro version of this grinder has that feature. That's designed to keep the grinding chamber at a stable temperature during operation. If you're using that version of this grinder, I would recommend just leaving the grinder on all the time so that this is already at a stable temperature when you go to start using it. Next, on this grinder, we have a component called the hopper. It's this piece on top that holds the beans going into the grinding chamber. On this grinder, there is a gate that closes off the hopper, and in order to remove the hopper, you have to slide that gate shut by moving a metal piece off to the left, and then you can lift out the hopper, and it looks like that. I would recommend, for all the grinders that I'm showing you, I would recommend putting in as much coffee as the hopper will hold. You'll find that that will give you much more consistent results throughout the day, as opposed to waiting until it gets empty to refill it. The piece of this hopper that closes off the chute looks like this. It's just a little piece of metal that slides across, and pretty much any espresso hopper will have some type of mechanism that allows you to close the hopper. That's really handy because it allows you to remove this hopper to clean it, which is really a good idea because it's really easy to get coffee oil built up on the inside of your hopper, and once it's built up, it's really tough to remove. So removing the hopper to clean it on a daily basis is a good idea. Just spray it down with water and then wipe it dry. Next on this grinder, we have a grind adjustment knob. Every grinder is going to have some mechanism that allows you to adjust the size of the particles that it produces when you grind coffee with it. And turning this knob will adjust inside of the grinder the position of what's called the burrs. So inside of any grinder that we're dealing with, we're going to have pieces called burrs that look something like this. So they're sometimes flat pieces with ridges cut into them, or on some grinders they might be conical pieces that look more like that. But when you adjust the grind setting, you're just moving those burrs either closer together to get a finer or smaller particle size, or further apart to get a larger or coarser particle size. On this grinder, the grind setting is adjusted using this knob off to the side here, and you can adjust the grind setting by turning this knob either clockwise to make the grind setting finer, or counterclockwise to make the grind setting coarser. And the adjustment on this grinder is very sensitive, so you really don't need to move it very far to get a noticeable result in how your espresso extraction changes due to the change in grind setting. So just be careful in making adjustments here. You're probably not going to turn the knob more than one notch or maybe even less than that at a time in order to make a noticeable change in your extraction. It's useful to note also that there are numbers on the dial here on the grind adjustment knob, and just to be clear, those numbers don't correspond to any units, and in fact there's no sort of absolute value that these numbers correspond to. In fact, you can adjust the numbers on the dial and the grind setting independently. So don't pay too much attention to the numbers on the dial, that doesn't tell you that much, but this dial does help give you a visual reference for how far you're adjusting when you do turn the adjustment knob. Next, let's take a look at the dose preset buttons and timer. So on the front panel of this version of the Mythos grinder, there are 5 buttons and a screen that gives us a number in seconds. The first 3 buttons here allow us to select 3 different presets. The way this grinder works is it will run anytime we activate it for a preset amount of time in order to give us a precise amount of coffee in our portafilter. So the first 3 buttons are just 3 different presets that I can select just by hitting those buttons. And then the last 2 buttons here correspond to minus and plus on the screen, so I can actually adjust my presets by increasing or decreasing the time by 1/100 of a second at a time. Finally, when we actually want to go and grind coffee with this grinder, we will need to use the activation switch, which in the case of this grinder is a switch or button that you push with the portafilter, and that activates the grinder. This grinder also has a little clip that holds the portafilter in place, so I can go and take my clean portafilter, lock it in the clip, and it will grind for this preset amount of time. Giving me a very precise amount of coffee in my portafilter basket. And then also a word of warning, you'll notice that there is a chute at the bottom where the grounds come out, and it's just really important that nothing goes up the chute of the grinder. It's really easy to get things jammed in the grinder or to cause damage to a small piece in here that's designed to crush clumps of espresso grounds. It's a very delicate piece and it's really easy to damage. So don't stick a brush or anything up the chute for this grinder or any of the other grinders that I'm showing you, because it's really easy to damage the grinder that way. So that's the Simonelli Mythos One. Let's move on to the Mahlkönig K30, which you'll see is similar in a lot of ways to the Mythos grinder. First off, there's a power switch on the back side here. Also, there's a hopper with a gate that can slide closed and then open again. This hopper can be removed by just twisting it counterclockwise and it pops off. And on this grinder, the grinder adjustment is done using this entire top piece, this collar, just underneath the hopper. And in order to make an adjustment to the grind setting on this grinder, you first have to loosen this set screw by loosening a knob here. And that allows you to use this lever arm here to turn this entire collar either counterclockwise for coarser or clockwise for finer. So you can turn it like so and it should move pretty freely. And then once you have your preferred grind setting, you tighten it back down to lock that in place. You want to make sure that this is tightened down so that your grind setting doesn't move when you actually operate the grinder. Next on this grinder we have a couple of different dose presets that we can select. Just like the Mythos grinder, this grinder operates by time, so you can select a preset amount of time for it to run to give you a precise amount of coffee in your portafilter basket. On this one, there's 2 presets you can select, which are buttons on either side of the front panel here. In order to adjust the dose presets on this grinder, what we need to do is just hold down both of these buttons at the same time. And on the screen, it will tell us that we now can adjust first this button by turning this dial, and we'll see the time change as we turn the dial. Once it's where we want it, we'll hit this button again, and it will now allow us to adjust this other preset if we would like, and we can do that by turning this dial. And then once we have it where we want it, we can save those settings by, again, holding these buttons down. The screen will say save, and then go back to normal operation. When I want to grind coffee on the K30, I just use a portafilter to press the activation button here, and coffee will come out of the chute directly into my portafilter basket for as long as I have programmed this cycle to run, giving me a precise amount of coffee in my basket. So that's the Mahlkönig K30. Let's also take a quick look at a Mazzer grinder. There's lots of different models of Mazzer out there. This is a pretty simple one. It's kind of an older model, but I just want to show you some components and show you that it's pretty similar in operation to these other grinders that we're looking at. So this grinder, just like the others, has a hopper with a gate on it. This hopper just lifts right out of the grinder like that. This grinder, also like the Mahlkönig grinder, has an adjustment collar to adjust the grind setting. So this collar turns, and you can turn it counterclockwise to make the grind setting finer, or clockwise to make the grind setting coarser. Sometimes this collar is a little bit tough to turn, so you may have a lever coming out that will help you get some leverage on the collar. Sometimes there will also be set screws on the top of this collar, and that's not like this knob on the Mahlkönig. The set screws that are on the top of this collar are basically just to limit how far you can turn it so you don't go too fine or too coarse, so you don't need to like loosen the set screw in the top in order to make that adjustment. And then this grinder doesn't have an automatic dosing mechanism the way that we have for the Mythos or the K30 grinder. Basically, this grinder is a super simple model. It basically just runs when I turn it on and stops when I turn it off, like that. Some models of Mazzer grinder, the newer models, will have a computerized dosing mechanism built into the lid on this chamber on the front. So you'll have a couple different buttons that you can push in order to activate the grinder, the same way that the K30 and the Mythos have different buttons to activate different presets amount of time. And just to give you a better idea of the parts of this grinder, on the front of this grinder you just have a big funnel basically. When you take the lid off, you can see the grinds exiting the grinding chamber here. Again, you want to be careful to not put brushes or anything into the chute where the grinds come out, because it's easy to get the grinder jammed or to damage it. So don't put anything through this chute here. When you activate the grinder, grinds will just come out of the chute and fall down the funnel into your portafilter position below. So that introduces you to some terminology and some key pieces of information for using the espresso machine and a few types of grinder. In the next video, we'll go over setting up the bar area and dialing in our espresso.